Hey there, I'm Matt, and I'm glad that you're taking some time to check out this video because we make these videos for people just like you, people who are searching to better understand their purpose, have a deeper faith and relationship with God, and also just to find some practical answers for navigating life's challenges. So regardless of whether you're feeling distant from God today, you're struggling with questions about life or faith, or you're simply wanting to grow closer to God, you're in the right place. We're in a series called Jesus in Genesis, and we're going back to the very beginning of recorded history. And we're finding that the stories that are recorded there are not just ancient myths or nice stories, but that when we piece them together, we see that God has been crafting a story of rescue and redemption since the very beginning of time. And as we live in a world that's often chaotic and uncertain and leaves us feeling overwhelmed and searching for more, we'll see how our modern existence is part of a much larger story that God has been writing. And from these stories, we'll gain a much deeper understanding of God's character and plan for our world, which can lead us to a place of greater faith and confidence in every single day of our lives. Let's get going.
When my wife and I did student ministry in Denver, Colorado, we had a middle school kid named Travis who was a stinking punk from day one. He was slipping in little swear words while I was teaching to his friends to make him laugh, but saying it just loud enough that I could hear it. And everything in me wanted to kick this kid out of the youth group because he was so disruptive. But for some reason, God softened my heart towards this kid, and I felt like if we could reach him, we could reach anybody. Now, his mom and dad were abusive parents by their own testimony, and were alcoholics. And Travis had a pretty traumatic childhood. And then his dad all of a sudden finds religion. His dad became a Christian, was baptized, and then like his whole life changed. And he started making Travis go to church, and he didn't want to go to church. And like now his dad is all acting like he's better than everybody else kind of thing. And that was Travis's perspective. So he was trying to figure out who he was. And he had all of this unresolved anger in his heart. And I'm just saying the beginning of his story started off very traumatic. And Travis ended up, after his 9th grade year, giving his life to God, asking Jesus to forgive him and save him from his sins. And God did. And God put his spirit in Travis. And that redirected the rest of his entire life. He ended up marrying this wonderful girl named Shannon. And last May 2023, I got to go to Travis's retirement party from the Air Force, where he was the senior master chief, I think is what his actual position was for Buckley Air Force Base. He was the highest ranking enlisted service personnel and was in charge of over 100 planes and their crew chiefs, fighter planes. It was a pretty big deal. There was a 4-star general that showed up for his graduation and everything. And it was a beautiful moment. In all of our lives. I've got a picture, and this is us. This is me and my wife with Travis and his wife, Shannon. And he's got 4 beautiful kids. He's an elder in the church that he attends. And like his story is wrapping up beautifully. And I got to meet dozens of other service personnel at his retirement party who had gone through some type of trauma in their story, either during their deployment or in coming back, trying to put the pieces of their lives back together again. And some of them with their own struggles and addiction. And I know that there are more than a few who had called Travis on the verge of ending their own lives, seeking hope that Travis was able to give because of the story of his own past. And Travis is a beautiful example of how God can take traumatic beginnings to build a dramatic ending. He makes like beauty out of chaos is what God does. And today we're going to be looking at a story of another example of God doing that. Genesis begins with the murder of a brother, and it ends with a brother they intended to murder. Brotherly conflict seems to be a common theme in the whole Bible, including Genesis. It starts with Cain and Abel, one murdering the other. Then it goes to Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. And today we're going to see how God intervenes in the narrative of an entire nation the nations around it, and a family. And he's going to use the dysfunctional choices of the past to bless people in the future. It's a story of frustration, sadness, betrayal, deception, and eventually hope. Now, God chooses 3 different families in the book of Genesis. He starts with the first family he chooses, which is Adam and Eve. Then he chooses another family, which is Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. And then God chooses Abraham. We talked about him, his son, and his grandson last week. And today we're going to be looking at his 12 great-grandsons. And the rest of the entire Bible is the story of God finishing, through the descendants of Abraham, what he had started in the garden when he chose to rescue Adam and Eve. And the Bible ends with God using the descendant of Abraham, or the seed of the woman, to rescue people from every ethnicity and culture from sin. We see a micro picture of this in the life of Noah. We see it in the life of Abraham. We see it in the life of Isaac, and we see it in the life of Jacob. And today we're going to see it in the life of Joseph. When I was 14, our church's youth group went to camp, and they had a preaching competition, which I don't know if you know any ninth graders are looking forward to that, but I signed up for it. And there were only 3 guys who preached for the preaching competition that year, and I didn't even place in the top 3. I have no idea what I said, but I know who I preached it on. And my very first sermon I ever preached on was on this guy, Joseph. And today I get to preach on him again, and I'm really excited about it. Now, to start the story from last week, Jacob reconciles with his brother Esau. Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines. This is one of the bases on which some, well, like the Mormons, based the idea, or used to base the idea, that it was okay for men to have multiple wives. But Isaac didn't have multiple wives. Abraham didn't have multiple wives. Jacob did. And this was never God's intention. And that's reaffirmed over and over and over again, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But it was a custom of the day that he had adapted to. So he's got Rachel and Leah as his wives. Each of them have a handservant who becomes a concubine, and that's Bilhah and Zilpah, unfortunately named ladies. But those are the 4 women that he has kids with. His oldest son, actually the first 4 kids, are all born through Leah. Now, if you remember, Leah was the girl who the Bible said she had weary eyes. And when the Bible says you're an unattractive woman, that says something. And he didn't love her, and it's a tragic part of the story. But Rachel, the wife that he did love, couldn't have kids. Leah gives him his first 4 sons. The first son is Reuben, and she named him Reuben because it says she said, "God sees me, now maybe my husband will love me." Like that's heartbreaking to me. Her second son she named Simeon, which means I am unloved, but God still favors me. The third son is Levi, which means maybe now I will be loved. And she still isn't. And what's beautiful is that her fourth son's name is Judah, which means I choose to praise God. Like at that point, she'd gotten freedom from the emotional abuse from her husband. She was still married to him, but she said, regardless of the circumstances I'm in, I choose to praise God anyway. And his name is Judah. We're going to come back to Judah later on in the story, which is kind of the reason why I wanted to point him out now. She then she stops having kids. Then Bilhah, which is Rachel's servant, gives birth to Dan and Naphtali. Gad comes from Zilpah, who is Leah's concubine, Gad and Asher. Then Leah has a kid again. She has Issachar, Zebulun, and then she gives birth to a girl named Dinah, who's the only daughter of Jacob that we have in the Bible. Now, there's a tragic story of Dinah, because I don't know the ages of everybody that listens to this sermon. I want to be careful, is sexually taken advantage of by a guy named Shechem, who then falls in love with her and wants to marry her. So he comes to Jacob and asks permission. And when her older full-blood brothers, Simeon and Levi, find out about it, they end up in this crazy story, murdering Shechem and all of the men in his village. Like, it's a slaughter. And you can read about that at another time if you want, but it's pretty rough, is what it is. But yeah, Simeon, the oldest brother, ends up having relations with Bilhah, Rachel's concubine, too. Like, this family is not the model of godliness by any stretch of the imagination. There's dysfunction and favoritism everywhere. Well, after Dinah is born, Rachel, his favored wife, finally gives birth to Joseph and Benjamin. We're going to start today in Genesis chapter 37. So if you've got your Bible, I'll start reading in verse 2. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. So I want to point out that Joseph was a tattletale, and nobody likes a snitch. I don't know if I should say that in a church service or in a sermon. But Jacob, verse 3, loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. You've heard of Joseph and the Technicolor dream coat. That's a derivative of this idea, but it was a coat of many colors. And verse 4, but his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them, and they couldn't say a kind word about him. And I'm going to say that I think his dad kind of set him up for this a little bit by playing favorites and making it obvious who his favorite was, because Joseph was constantly wearing the symbol of his dad's favor. Now, he's got 10 older brothers that the dad does not love, obviously, as much as he loves son number 11. And they resented Joseph for this. Now, Joseph ends up having a dream. And in his dream, there are 11 sheaves of wheat. And he says, and 10 of the sheaves bowed down to my sheaf. And they're like, and he tells his brother this dream. There's like 11 brothers, and 10 of them bow down to one of them. Well, that makes them hate him even more. And then shortly after that, he has another dream. And in this dream, the sun, the moon, and, his brother is the 11th sheaf. His is the 12th sheaf. Bundle of wheat. And in the next dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all bow down to him. And even his dad is like, Joseph, like, you're being ridiculous, like a little bit of a jerk. And the brothers are like, what, are you saying that the rest of us are going to bow down to you? And then Jacob says, are you saying that even your mother and I will someday bow down to you? Like, where are you going with this? And they hate him even more. Well, the next part of this story we're going to read is in Genesis chapter 37 in verse 18. Joseph is sent out into the wilderness to check on his brothers who's watching their father's flocks. And in verse 18, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. And as he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and we can tell our dad that a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what becomes of his stupid dreams. But when Reuben, the oldest son, the oldest brother, heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue and said, let's not kill him. Like, he's the oldest brother, and so he's doing what the oldest brother does. I'm the oldest brother, and we have a little bit of a sense of wanting to make our daddies proud, right? So sometimes we'll act in their stead. And so Reuben, then as the oldest son, says, well, we can't kill him, obviously. So what he does instead is he talks his brothers into selling Joseph into human trafficking, because that's so much better. They're Midianite traders on their way to, by the way, these guys are descendants of their uncle. Like, these guys are distant cousins. These are Esau's like descendants, and they're on their way to Egypt, and they buy Joseph for 30 pieces of silver. Then they take Joseph's Technicolor dream coat, they rip it to shreds, and they dip it in the blood of one of the animals that a lamb or whatever that they had killed, take it back to their dad and said, Dad, we never saw, where's your brother Joseph? We never saw him, but we did find his jacket and it's covered with blood. What do you think happened? He's like, a lion must have eaten him. And they're like, yeah, we guess so, right? Oh, wow, that's sad. And then they get rid of their brother. But as far as they're concerned, he becomes a slave where he would have been worked to the bone and then died. And but at least they're not the ones to have killed him. Now, in the account of Genesis, there's an interlude here where Jacob, the dad, the oldest brother, not the oldest brother, Judah, which is the fourth son. So the oldest brother, Reuben, is the one who has relations with his stepmom's concubine. The other two have murdered everybody in Shechem. The fourth son, Judah, has a boy who's married who dies before he can have any kids. So as was the custom of the day, the next son had to have relations with his oldest brother's wife so that his oldest brother could have a kid to inherit whatever Judah had to pass on. And he died. And then the third son was given to this woman. Her name is Tamar. And then he dies. And so he has a youngest son. And he goes, I'm not going to give him to Tamar because he may die too. So he says to Tamar, go back to your people. And when my youngest son is old enough, I'll give him to you in marriage. And he doesn't. And when she finds out that even his youngest son, Judah's youngest son, is given to another woman, she finds out where Judah's going to be. And she dresses up as a lady of the evening, prostitute. And Judah, when visiting this village, has relations with her. But doesn't have anything to pay her with. So he gives her his robe and his walking stick as collateral until he can pay her the next day. They go back the next day, and she's not anywhere to be found. They ask everybody, hey, is there a prostitute that's normally here? And they're like, no, there's no prostitute in this village. So like, okay, that's weird. I guess I'll just never see my jacket and robe again. Months go by, and then he finds out that his oldest son's widow, actually his oldest three sons' widow, has gotten pregnant. And so he demands her brought to him where he's going to have her executed for adultery. And she says, but you didn't give me to your son. He says, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't have gotten pregnant outside of wedlock. And she says, and he says, who did this? And she goes, the man who got me pregnant is the man who owns this robe and this walking stick. And then Judah sees that it's him. And he repents. And here's what's crazy. Tamar is the first woman mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. So the baby that's born to Tamar, who played a prostitute, in order to exact revenge on Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, becomes an ancestor of Jesus. That's crazy. Now Judah's going to come up at the end of the story too. Back to Joseph. Joseph is sold to the captain of the palace guard, Pharaoh's personal bodyguard. He's the captain, and he's the one who purchases Joseph off the trading block. Everything Joseph touches turns to gold. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 6, it says this. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what to eat for lunch. Joseph was a very handsome man and very well built. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded, but Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do, and he has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against who? God. Now, I read this story, and sometimes when I read the stories I see in the Bible, I put myself in their head, is that how I would have responded? So I don't know if you caught that or not. But Joseph didn't want to do this because he knew that it was a sin against God. And then my thought is, at this point in Joseph's life, from his perspective, what had God ever done for him? Like, it's not his fault that his dad favors him more than all of his brothers. It's not his fault that his dad gave him the assignment of going and checking up on his older brothers and bringing back a report of what they had done. It's definitely not his fault that they beat the living tar of him, dropped him in a well, and then sold him into slavery. It's not his fault that he was treated badly on the way and then put up on an auction block and then sold into slavery and for the rest of his life was going to be indentured servitude. Like, his life goes from good to bad to bad to bad to bad to bad. Like, it just keeps getting worse. And then when he's given the opportunity to like squeeze out some satisfaction in life, he still says, I will honor God. Now, Potiphar's wife is embarrassed by this, and she grabs his jacket. He leaves his jacket in her hand and runs out of the house. Well, she's embarrassed, humiliated, because a slave wouldn't sleep with her. So she screams out and cries out rape. And then there's no trial in those days, especially for a slave. So Joseph is then just thrown into prison where he will rot for the rest of his life. And so now his life is even getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It just keeps getting worse. While he's in prison, he meets two guys who have dreams. They tell their dream to Joseph, and he says, I think I know what that means. Remember, Joseph had already had two dreams. He interprets both of them correctly, and he says, but only God can give the interpretation of dreams. So even in prison, he's recognizing the authority of God in his life. But what did God do? Like, so far, there's no advantage to following God, but it doesn't matter because he knows there is a God, and whatever happens in my life is my lot. What I will always do is obey God and worship him. And he does. He's there for a while longer, and finally, Pharaoh has a dream. Well, one of the guys that he interpreted the dream for in prison ends up being executed, just like Joseph had said. The other guy was the butler for Pharaoh, and he gets restored to his position. And Pharaoh has nightmares, two different nightmares, but he thinks they have the same meaning. And none of the Egyptian mystics can interpret the dream. In fact, what he says is I'm not even going to tell you the dream. You have to interpret it on your own. They said nobody can do this. Like, yeah, tell us the dream first. He says, no. If you really do have divine powers, you'll tell me what my dream is and what it means. And so the butler says to Pharaoh, well, I can remember a guy who interpreted dreams, but he's in prison. Pharaoh says, bring him out. And Joseph comes out and he says, tell me what my dreams mean. And he says, only God can do this. But here's what your dreams are and here's what they mean. And the interpretation of the dream is that there's going to be 7 years of feast where everybody's crops will be crazy abundant. And he says, you need to take 1/5 of everything and store it up because it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And these famine will be worse than anybody's ever even heard of. And then this happens in Genesis chapter 41, verse 33. Therefore, this is still Joseph talking. He says, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. And then he gives a few more instructions on what he thinks this wise man that Pharaoh's going to appoint does it. Now, I don't think Joseph had aspirations to be that wise man because 1, he's not an Egyptian. 2, he's a convicted felon who is accused of sexually assaulting one of the captain of the household guard of the Pharaoh, who was probably in that very room as Joseph was speaking. So he knows it's not going to be him. But after he gives these instructions, Pharaoh responds in verse 38. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you clearly, no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt, which is insane. Like, that's nuts. And here's what's crazy. He becomes a number 2 person over all of Egypt, which even modern day historians say was one of the most powerful dynasties in the history of the world. And none of it would have happened had he not gone through all of that horrible trauma in his past. Well, there are 7 great years and then there are 7 famine years. And after the first year of the famine, it's affecting not just Egypt, but nations all around. And it affects the land of Canaan, which is where Jacob and the other 11 brothers and all of their families are living. And the brothers are sent to Egypt because they hear that Egypt has extra food. And they do because they've been following Joseph's advice. So the brothers are sent to Egypt to buy grain. And when they get there, Joseph recognizes them and says, make them stand in the line to talk to me. So when the brothers come up before this is Joseph now, who looks completely Egyptian, sitting on a throne in front of 10 of his 11 brothers, because the dad kept Benjamin, who's Joseph's little brother by the same mom, back at home because that became his new favorite. So the older 10 brothers are there. These are the 10 guys who conspired to sell him into slavery. And Joseph knows this. And he doesn't speak to them in Hebrew. He speaks to them through an interpreter in Egyptian. Gives them a hard time. He asks them about their family. And by the way, do you have any other brothers who aren't here? Yes, we have a son named Benjamin. Well, how is he doing? They're like, that's odd, that he would ask us about our family. But they don't think too much of it. They think Joseph is dead. And this guy's an Egyptian. So he's just asking, maybe he does this with everybody. Well, on their way back home to Canaan, they stop and they show their dad and they bring out all these bags of grain. And when they open up their grain to show their father, Jacob, they find all the money that their dad had sent them with to buy this grain was put back on the top of their sacks. And oh my gosh, and by the way, when Joseph sent them away, they said they had a younger brother. And he said, you might be spies. And they're like, no, we're not spies. And he says, all right, for proof, I'm going to keep one of your brothers as ransom until you bring me the younger brother, and that's what I'll see. You said you have a younger brother, so that you will not be able to come back into this country without being killed unless you have your younger brother with you. And to make sure that they come back, he keeps Simeon, who's the second oldest brother, as a hostage. So when they get back, Jacob says, where's your brother Simeon? And he said, he kept him as a ransom. Why? Because he asked us if we were spies. We said we weren't. And he says, well, do you have any other family members? We said we had our youngest brother. And he said, well, then as proof, you have to bring your younger brother. Jacob is distraught. He says, everything in my life is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. The money's back in the bag. They're going to accuse us of stealing from them. And they kept Simeon, my second oldest son, as a hostage. And now they want my youngest son, the only surviving son of my wife. That's what he referred to her as. He had 2 wives, but Rachel's the one that he loved most. Another year goes by and the famine is so bad they have to go back. And Jacob sends them back. And they said, well, we can't go without our brother or they'll kill Simeon, at least, and maybe us. The dad is distraught. And the brothers say, Dad, we promise we will not come back without Benjamin. We promise, we promise, we promise, we promise, we promise. Then they go back. This is Genesis chapter 42. When the brothers came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him everything that had happened to them. The man, now they're telling about the story of Joseph. The man who was governor of the land spoke very harshly to us. He accused us of being spies, but we said we're honest men, not spies. We're 12 brothers, sons of the one father. One brother is no longer with us, and the youngest is at home with our father in Canaan. Then the man who was governor of the land told us, this is how I will find out if you're honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take grain for your starving families and go on home, but you must bring your youngest brother back to me. Then I'll know that you're honest men and not spies. Then I'll give you back your brother, and you may trade freely in the land. As they emptied out their sacks, there in each man's bag was the money that he had paid for the grain. The brothers and their father were terrified when they saw the bags of money, and Jacob exclaimed, you are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin too. Everything is going against me. And Reuben said, you may kill my 2 sons if I don't bring back Benjamin to you. I'll be responsible, and I'll bring him back. And that's the oldest brother doing what oldest brothers do. So when they returned, Genesis 43, the brothers approached the manager of Joseph's household and spoke to him at the entrance of the palace and said, Sir, we came to Egypt once before, it was a year ago, to buy food. But as we were returning home, we stopped for the night and opened our sacks, and there we discovered each man's money, the exact amount that was paid on top of our sack. Here it is. We brought it all back. We've also brought additional money to buy more food. We have no idea who put the money in our sacks. Relax. Don't be afraid, the household manager told them. Your God, the God of your father, must have put this treasure in your sacks. I know I received your payment. Then he released Simeon and brought him out to them. Now the manager takes them into Joseph's private residence again because Joseph wants to see them, and they're going to have a meal together. Now remember, they have Benjamin with them. Verse 27, after greeting them, he asked, how is it your father, an old man you spoke about? Is he still alive? Yes, they replied, our father, your servant, is alive and well. And they bowed low again, just like Joseph had said in his dreams. Verse 29, then Joseph looked at his brother Benjamin, the son of his own mother. Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? Joseph asked. May God be gracious to you, my son, he says to Benjamin. Then Joseph hurried from the room because he was overcome with emotion for his brother. And he went into his private room where he broke down and started crying, but he didn't want them to see him cry. Then he ordered, after washing his face, verse 31, he came back out, keeping himself under control. And then he ordered, bring out the food. And the waiters served Joseph at his own table. And his brothers were served at a separate table because the Egyptians who ate with Joseph sat at their own table, because Egyptians despise Hebrews and refused to eat with them. Joseph told each one of his brothers where to sit. And to their amazement, he seated them according to age from the oldest to youngest, because he knows them. And they don't know what's happening right now. Joseph then fills their sacks of grain. He puts all of their money back in it again, and then instructs his servants to put his personal silver cup in the sack of Benjamin. Then they ride out. They get a day's distance away. Joseph sends his household manager after them, who catches up to them and said, our master has been so kind to you. Why would you treat him so poorly? And they said, what are you talking about? So why would you steal his silver cup? And they said, none of us have done this. And so they go back to Egypt. They open up all of the sacks, and then they find the silver cup. And, before they go back, one of the brothers says, if you find the silver cup in one of our bags, that man will be your slave for life. And the household manager says, deal. They go back to Joseph's private residence. All the sacks are opened. And then they find the silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And now his life is doomed. He's going to spend the rest of his life as a slave. Watch what happens in Genesis chapter 44. Verse 18. Then Judah stepped forward and said, please, my lord, let your servant say just one word. Please do not be angry with me, even though you are as powerful as Pharaoh himself. And he tells him the whole story. We had a younger brother, Benjamin's oldest brother, who's already died from the wife that he loved. And this is his last son. And if he dies, if he's taken, if you make him a slave and we go back without our youngest brother, the grief will kill our father. Like by keeping our youngest brother, you are sentencing our father to death. A few verses later, he says this in verse 25. Later, when he said, go back again and buy us more food, this is Judah telling the story. This is the fourth son of Jacob. We replied, we can't go unless you let our youngest brother go with us. We'll never get to see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then my father said to us, as you know, my wife had 2 sons, and one of them went away and never returned. Doubtless he was torn to pieces by a wild animal. I have never seen him since. Now, if you take his brother away from me and any harm comes to him, you will send this grieving old white-haired man to his grave. And now, my Lord, I cannot go back to my father without the boy. Our father's life is bound up in the boy's life. If he sees that the boy is not with us, our father will die. We, your servants, will indeed be responsible for sending that grieving white-haired man to his grave. My Lord, I guaranteed to my father that I would take care of the boy, and I told him, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame forever. So please, verse 33, my Lord, let me stay here as a slave instead of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. Here's another side note. Chapter 49, Jacob gathers all 12 of his sons together, and he gives each one of them a blessing. He starts with Reuben, who's the oldest, who should get the blessing of the firstborn, who's the one through whom the Messiah would come. That's the blessing from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and it should go to Reuben. But because Reuben had slept with Rachel's concubine, he doesn't get the firstborn blessing. Simeon should get it, though, and he doesn't get it because he had slaughtered all of those people in Shechem. Levi should get it because he's the third son, and he doesn't, because he also, with Simeon, slaughtered all of the men of Shechem. So we get to the fourth born son of Jacob. And he gets this blessing in chapter 49, verse 8. Judah, your brothers will praise you. You will grasp your enemies by the neck. This is his blessing. All of your relatives will bow before you. Judah, my son, is a young lion that has finished eating his prey. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down like a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter, that's what a king holds. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor. Who do you think that is? The Messiah, Jesus. So Jacob says it's going to be from not Reuben, not Simeon, not Levi, but Judah, through whom the Messiah will show up. So to me, it's not a surprise that Judah would be the one to offer his life as a ransom to redeem Benjamin from death. Judah models what his future descendant will end up doing for all of mankind. It's beautiful. So when Joseph sees this, he's overcome with emotions, and he reveals himself to him. Genesis chapter 45. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, out, all of you. So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing right here in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Verse 12. Then Joseph added, look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. Go tell my dad my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything that you have seen, and then bring my father here quickly. Verse 15. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them. And after that, they began talking freely with him. And the news soon reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph's brothers have arrived. Pharaoh and his officials were all delighted to hear this. Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, this is what you must do. Load your pack animals and hurry back to the land of Canaan and get your father and all of your families and return here to me. I will give you the very best land in Egypt, and you will eat from the best that the land produces. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, take the wagons from the land of Egypt to carry your little children, your wives, and bring your father here. Don't worry about your personal belongings, for the best of all that the land of Egypt is yours. And that's how the Jews end up in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, the best land in all of Egypt. And then there are multiple generations of pharaohs who go by who forget the promises and the way that God had rescued not just the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but all of Egypt and all of the nations around them from the famine because of what God had done through Joseph, this ancient picture of the Messiah who rescues all people everywhere also. And that's in the next series that we're going to be reading about. When Jacob dies and he blesses them in chapter 49, all the brothers feel that now Joseph is going to exact revenge and kill him. And Joseph says in Genesis chapter 50, verse 19, but Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. Now we see Jesus in the personal sacrifice of Judah himself when he offered to lay down his life to ransom, to buy back Benjamin, who, according to the Egyptians, deserved life in enslavement. We also see Jesus in the life of Joseph, who was betrayed by his own people, but sent to be executed by those who were not of his people. We see Joseph sold into the hands of his executioners for 30 pieces of silver, who is then brought back to life again in the eyes of his family who thought him to be dead. And in his post-death experience was to ransom and save not just the people of Israel, but all of Egypt and anyone else who would come. And that's the story of Joseph. What do we personally take from this? I've got 4 things. The first is this. that God will accomplish his purpose in our lives in ways we did not expect or possibly even ask for. You may be going through your own, I don't know how to describe this, your own valley of the shadow of death, your own being sold into slavery experience, your own being beaten and thrown on the bottom of a well experience, your own being hated by your brother's experience, or sold on an auction block, or mistreated, or lied about, like Potiphar's wife. You may be in prison. You may feel stuck in your circumstances. Like, you see what I'm saying? But all of that was working itself out towards something. Romans chapter 8 says that, and we know this, that God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. And that's what Joseph never forgot. And that's the second thing, that in the middle of our suffering, we must continually pursue godliness and live in the fear of the Lord, because God is good even when life is not. And God's keeping score, and he knows how the end of your life goes, and you're just in the scary middle chapters. Don't grab the pen out of his hand or close the book too soon, or you won't get to the Prince of Egypt part. You know what I mean? Like, you might be going through something personally traumatic, but that does not mean that God does not love you or does not see you. And right now is a time for you to recognize God's sovereignty over the things that other people have done to us, or maybe the place that you got yourself into, and recognize that this isn't the end, that God gets the last say. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 says, so let's not get tired of doing what is good, because at just the right time, we'll reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. What others meant for harm, God intends for good. And then the last lesson is this, that God isn't just for his kids, just the children of Israel, just for Christians. God is for anybody that will come to him. God's rescue of the people of Israel included the Egyptians. And Jesus' redemption of the Jews is also for the Romans. All people, everywhere, to be reconciled to God. I don't know which one of those 4 lessons most applies to you. I hope you do. And we're going to close in prayer, and I want you to talk to God about where you see yourself in the story of Joseph. Let's pray. God, I love you with all of my heart. And I'm praying for those who right now are particularly feeling that life is kicking them in the teeth. And we wonder where in the world you are. And you are working all things out for your glory and their good. We just don't see it. But we know you're there. That's what faith is. Faith is continuing to do the right thing even when we don't feel like it. And we do it because we trust you. And that's faith. When we believe in you enough to trust you enough to keep obeying you and recognizing your authority over our lives. God, for those of us who have gotten kicked in the teeth and we've gone back to our old sin, forgive us and bring us back. Maybe that's your prayer. God, I'm sorry for wandering away and I'm ready to come back. Make that your prayer. Maybe right now, it's not that I've gone away, I'm just losing hope. So maybe your prayer is, God, I will say that you are good even if life is not. And I will praise you even when I don't feel you. Maybe your prayer is, God, don't let me quit because I'm tired. Put gas in my tank and help me to keep going. And maybe you feel like God only blesses and loves good people, but God blessed and loved the Egyptians too. He can love you. So if you're tired of running from God, then your prayer is, God, I'm tired of running from you and I want to come back to you. Take me back, please. Make that your prayer. This is what we ask in the name of Jesus, and we all say together, amen.
Hey, thank you for taking the time to check out this content. I really hope that you were able to find something helpful here today. And every week as we examine these ancient stories and see how God's plan and the person of Jesus is connected to our modern lives, I think that it would be a really good idea for you to take a few moments, maybe just right after this video, and think through what this content means for you. Maybe you've been trying to find belonging and purpose in your life, and maybe the invitation that you're feeling from God today is that you need to lean into faith more in order to find that. Or maybe you consider yourself to be a person of faith already, but at times just struggle to follow God completely. But whatever your barrier might be, our church wants to help you take the next step no matter what it is. In fact, right now, our entire church is going through a Bible reading plan so that we can help understand more of the story that God is writing and the part that we play in it. So if you want to be a part of that, you can just text the word Bible to the number that's on your screen. We'll help you get all set up so that you can receive that. We really do want to help you however we can. Thanks so much for watching today. We'll see you again next time.